Good day and welcome to the viewing and listening audience to this, the 13th meeting of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration. This is the committee's second hearing with stakeholders pursuant to its inquiry into the state's capacity to provide support for victims of domestic violence and family conflicts, with specific focus on the availability of support mechanisms during the COVID-19 pandemic. Members of the public are invited to submit their comments and/or questions via the Parliament's social media platforms, including YouTube, ParlView, or via Facebook or Twitter. Our representatives before us today are from the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence, the ASC, the Organization for Abused and Battered Individuals, OABI, and the Trinidad Shelter for Battered Women and Children, TSBWC. The inquiry objectives are as follows. 1, to examine trends in domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago for the period March 2020 to March 2022, compared with previous periods. 2, to examine the state's policies, projects, and initiatives aimed at providing support for domestic violence victims. 3, to examine the capacity of state-funded organizations and institutions to provide adequate support to victims of domestic violence. And the 4th objective is to evaluate the effectiveness of support provided to domestic violence victims by the state for the period March 2020 to present. While the inquiry objective states certainly to March 2020, the nature of the issue before us certainly will lend itself to discussions on the prevailing and underlying issues that may factors that contribute and unfortunately continue to see a situation where domestic violence remains prevalent in Trinidad and Tobago. So the discussion sometimes wanders a bit wider than that. I'm the committee's chairman, Paul Richards. I'd like to at this time invite members of the committee to introduce themselves, starting with Member Beckles. Member Beckles, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair, and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate on what we consider to be a very important topic. So let me first of all indicate that and make a request for the benefit of the listening and viewing public. Can you indicate what is the mandate of the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence?
Member Beckles, we just do the introductions now, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was
yes, just the introductions. Okay. Member Mohit, go ahead, please. Not a problem. Member Mohit.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee and all of those who are joining us. Thank you, and I look forward to a progressive session.
Thank you. Member Naked.
Good morning to all of you, and looking forward to a productive session.
Thank you, members. Ford.
Good morning, public of Trinidad and Tobago, the viewing public today. Esmond Ford, member of the committee. Thank you.
And Member Singh. Member Singh, you're muted, I think.
Again, Avinash Singh. Sorry. Good morning, Avinash Singh, member.
Thank you so much. The other two members will join us in process, and they are Member Rohan Siminan and Member Roger Monroe. At this time, I'd like to invite members of the groups before us to please introduce themselves and their groups. I know the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence is an umbrella organization, so I don't know if Ms. Roberta Clark will be introducing the group, or would you like members of each of the other members with you and the Alliance to also issue short opening statements?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Roberta Clark, and I am associated with the Alliance through my membership of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I will be making the introductory remarks on behalf of the Alliance, but we do believe in self-identity, and I would like to ask the members of the Alliance to introduce themselves.
Not a problem. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, everyone. Go ahead, Gabby.
My name is Gabrielle Hossain. I am from the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, which is a member of the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence.
Thank you. Ms. Mohammed.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Asiya Mohammed, CEO of Conflicts Women Limited, and we're also pleased to be a member of the Alliance for State Action to End GBV.
Thank you. And Ms. Acosta.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Safia Acosta. I am a representative of Womantra, which is also a proud member of the Alliance for State Action.
Thank you. Roberta, would you like to deliver your opening remarks at this time? Thank you for the familiarity. I've known all these groups for a while, so I may get overly familiar sometimes. I apologize.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, we are Caribbean people, and we don't misunderstand familiarity other than being just that, friendly. I would like to start off by thanking the members of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration for its invitation to the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence to appear before you and to give us this opportunity to share our perspectives on the state capacity needed to provide support to victims of domestic violence and in the context of family conflicts. A member of Parliament, Ms. Beckles, Honorable Penny Beckles, has asked about the who is or what is the Alliance for State Action. Just to say, the Alliance for State Action is a network of organizations working on ending gender-based violence and working to advance human rights and also to advance gender equality in Trinidad and Tobago. Our objective is to work in solidarity across the diversity of our organizations, to monitor state action and to advocate for state accountability to prevent and respond effectively to end gender-based violence. And we have been as this network since 2018, and we were very much part of the consultations with the then Attorney General and his team on the reforms to the Domestic Violence Act, and we've held together also commenting on various iterations of amendments to the Sexual Offences Act. So also very happy to be here with you today. We consider that the state has what we would say as a non-negotiable and even a sacred duty an obligation, pressing obligation to respond to domestic violence, both its causes and its consequences. And this obligation, this non-negotiable obligation, is rooted in our constitution of this country, our constitutional guarantees, including the right to life, the right to liberty, security of the person, very importantly, security of the person, equality before the law, protection of the law, and equality of treatment from public authorities, amongst other rights. But we think these are really very germane to this issue. And we also want to remind the Joint Select Committee that Trinidad and Tobago has ratified the Inter-American Convention on the prevention, punishment of all forms of violence against women, what we know of familiarly as the Belém do Pará Convention. And under that convention, states are obligated to take all appropriate measures to, and without delay, these are important words, without delay, to prevent, punish, and eradicate violence against women, and to promote lives free of violence. So it's an obligation of state conduct, but it's also an obligation to transform social and cultural norms based on equality amongst all people. And so we recognize that the state has taken a number of measures over many years, starting with the first iteration of the Domestic Violence Act going back to 1991. And more latterly, over the last 2-3 years, the establishment of a specialized police unit, there's a specialized unit within the Office of the Prime Minister, there is the Central Data Registry. So there are a number of initiatives ongoing, and often these initiatives are undertaken in collaboration with non-governmental organizations. But we are saying here very clearly today, and we've been saying for quite a while, that the actions that are being taken by the state, and we use the state in the broadest non-partisan, non-political way, the actions taken by the state have to be sufficient to meet the scale of the challenge. So there must be political will to meet the scale of the challenge. Domestic violence is the most perpetrated crime in this country. If you take account of the prevalence surveys undertaken by IDB and the qualitative analysis undertaken under the leadership of Dr. Gabriel Hussein, who's here today, domestic violence is the number one crime committed in this country. And so we say that we need political will to address that. And I always like to define, when I say political will, what I mean. And simply we mean that the state has to have the intention and the capacity or the capacities to realize an objective. And that objective has to be very clearly stated to respond to the causes and the consequences of domestic violence. And for us, really important to focus on the causes, because we understand domestic violence is very much related to inequality, gender inequality in particular, and unequal power relations within the household. So we welcome this opportunity to be with you, and we have responses to a number of your questions. We want to apologize for the late submission of our written draft. It's still a draft, and we hope that you give us an opportunity to finalize it and to resubmit it after this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Clark, and we will appreciate the submission of the completed document thereafter. Let's go now to the officials of the Center for Nonviolence Research and Development, Mrs. Shirna Alexander Benjamin. Go ahead, please.
I acknowledge the chair and I say good morning to the chair, members of the committee, and my fellow colleagues. As I move forward in transparency, I am also, and our organization is also a member of the coalition, the State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we do so proudly support it. However, today we appear before you as the Center for Nonviolence Research and Development, formerly the Organization for Abused and Battered Individuals. I'm Shirna Alexander Benjamin, and my fellow colleagues with me today are Asha Garib, clinical psychologist, and Shamea Wade, attorney at law.
Now you have opening comments?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead, please.
We appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and we ask that the state consider their position as power holders, but also to understand that they need to share this power to create equitable access and provide access to resources for people experiencing violence, to create bridging social capital and sustainable resources to prevent violence, protect people experiencing violence, and hold perpetrators accountable. Failure to do so is an act of the highest form of violence against its people whom it claims to serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would your other members like to identify themselves?
Yes, I will hand over to Ms. Asha Garib and then Shamea Wade.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Asha Garib, clinical psychologist. Thank you for this opportunity to be here, and I look forward to a productive meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Gibson Wadi.
Good morning. Good morning to the chair and to the members of the committee. I am Shamea Gibson Wadi. I'm currently an attorney at law, and I hope I can make some contribution to this topic, which is of vast importance.
I'm sure you can. Thank you for being with us. And now on to the officials of the Trinidad Shelter for Battered Women and Children. And I also know Mr. Mitchell very well. Colin Mitchell, good morning.
Good morning, Chair. It's good to see you again. Honorable members, colleagues. My name is Colin Mitchell. I am chairman of the shelter. We are a safe house for victims of domestic violence, and we are located in Port of Spain. I have with me our vice chair, Mrs. Sharon Harford. You would see her on the screen. Regarding opening comments, so I'll just give you a quick history of the shelter. Some of you may know already. We were established in 1987 by Mr. Anna Mahabir Wyatt. That's about 35 years ago. We are more than just a hotel for victims of domestic violence, women and their children. We offer many more services, including medical care, therapeutic counseling, school placement for the children, skill set training, legal support, assistance with housing. We do a lot of advocacy work and legal change. And we desperately need more money to operate. 2020 was extremely challenging for us. We were unable to do any fundraising activities whatsoever. And our subvention from the government is only $7,500 TT per month. Our operating costs are over 10 times that per month. And I actually spend most of my time now fundraising when I rather invest my time in really getting the help to the women and children, the help that they desperately need to get them ready for society. So that's really what I wanted to speak about today, and that's the shelter in a nutshell. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And the other members, of course, Ms. Sharon Harford, who is the Vice Chairman of the Trinidad Shelter for Battered Women and Children. Before I hand over to my colleague, Member Beckers, let me start with Ms. Roberta Clark and ask you, spoke earlier on in your opening comments about causes and consequences. Domestic violence and gender-based violence has been a significant issue for Trinidad and Tobago for decades. I've done some research myself, and the numbers are startling. And there's a debate on as to whether there had been an increase during the pandemic period or not. What has your umbrella organization have your organizational members told you, and what is your sense of intervention mechanisms and support mechanisms provided during the core of the pandemic? We kind of ruling out the pandemic, thank God now. In terms of your organizations, I think it's 15 organizations under your umbrella, and whether or not they were able to access effective mechanisms for intervention and support.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you want me to respond now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And of course, the other members of the Alliance will join in as they can. So the question on whether or not reports increase, I think we cannot say with any certainty what is the status of the reports, only because so much of what we know to be domestic violence in this country goes unreported. And of course, we have several forms of domestic violence, but interpersonal and interspousal violence. We have violence perpetrated against children. We have elderly violence, violence against people living with disabilities in the home. So there's a broad spectrum of violence. And what we know for sure, certainly on the interpersonal violence, and Dr. Hussein is here, and she can speak a little bit more about the research. There's three things happening here in relation to the data. One, that you have the majority of your cases go unreported. Most women do not report a violence that they experience. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have, once reports have been made, that you may have a lack of recording of the reports. And we even still hear that within the context of policing. Women go to the police and they say, they never gave me a receipt. Well, the receipt is supposed to be the way that we know that the complaint has been recorded in the police records. And then the third factor here, because people who experience violence go to a number of sites for response and for services, these sites don't necessarily share their data. So we don't start off with any firm foundation about what is the incidence of domestic violence, though the research tells us something about the prevalence, that 1 in 3 women who have been involved in interpersonal relationships with men have experienced violence, but we don't know really accurately about the incidence. Now, in relation to the experience in the time of COVID, what we do have from the police is that there was a sense that at some stage in the pandemic, in relation to the mobility restrictions and the closure of schools and the closure of work and people being sort of kept in houses, at some stage there was some increase of reports to police. But of course, the reports to the police never match the reports, generally speaking. So to give you an example of what I'm saying, the police sort of report maybe a few hundred of cases a year. And when you look at the applications made to the court, those applications on average are over 9,000 applications a year. So what people are actually doing when they don't report, but they go to the court, is quite different from when they report. So it's difficult to know what has happened. I think also in relation to the membership of this alliance, some of these members, of course, our services were interrupted. Some of us had to go online. Some of us had to close because of, as Colin has just said, the shelters could not maintain the resource mobilization which they have to do, not to augment the subvention, because the subvention is so inadequate, but to actually keep their shelter alive, and there were other issues there. So services were disrupted, but for example, within the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, we went online. We were doing our psychosocial services online, and there definitely was an increase in the calls that we received. The other data source, Mr. Chairman, is the 800 Save. And I don't have the data from them now, but that's also a space where you can perhaps get a sense of what were the increasing calls to 800 Save. So I'll stop there. I don't know if the others want to say anything.
Thank you. You mentioned Dr. Hussein may have some of the data. And a question before Dr. Hussein provides whatever data she may have. And this is to all, were persons who were involved in shelters and intervention and support, did they fall under the rubric of essential services during the pandemic? Because I'm thinking that given the nature of the issue, they should have been. Can anyone answer that?
Chair, is that question directed to me? Because
if you can also, you may have the experience. Yeah.
I think the hands are up of some of our service providers, and we should hear from them first in the Alliance.
Okay, Ms. Mohammed?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hussein. So at Conflicts Women, we did have an increase in reports. What was really interesting is our services focus on economic empowerment. So we provide seed capital and grants for rape and domestic violence survivors who are starting their businesses, right? So either launching a business or expanding. And we have a number of donors who support us in this regard. What we saw pre-pandemic, we didn't have very many requests, for example, for basic items like food hampers. Post-pandemic, that changed. So during the pandemic, we actually had to do 5 different rounds of food hamper distribution, which is not something that we had to do before March 2020. Right, so that has sort of been ongoing for the past 2 years. The other key thing that we saw that really was not such an issue before is survivors being unable to pay their rent. And we need to understand gender-based violence in the wider context of the economy and what's been happening during the pandemic. So we did see a number of survivors, unfortunately, who were evicted with children during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's not something that we actually received reports on beforehand. So the experiences are very different, and some of these survivors would have actually approached the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to access the rent assistance grants. However, that process can be quite delayed, and it also requires a number of documents. So we did have survivors who were evicted whilst awaiting that grant. So that's what I wanted to share for now. Thank you.
Echoes, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you very much for the information to date. I'd just like to follow up on my initial question and ask this question, which is your submission, that is the submission received by the committee, indicates that one of the trends observed by the Alliance for State Action to End Gender-Based Violence was that persons had to rapidly adapt to online support. So what kind of online support was provided to persons who contacted the ASC?
Roberta, I don't know if you want me to go first.
Go ahead, and then I'll follow you.
Okay, all right. So pre-pandemic, Conflicts Women focuses on economic empowerment. So we do workshops and business trainings for survivors. And from 2014, when we were launched, until 2020, all these workshops took place in person. With survivors in Trinidad and Tobago. So what has happened is in March 2020, we had to make a decision to put all of our services online. So all of their business workshops, their training, etc., everything had to go online, utilizing Zoom. We had to do tech assessments with survivors. Half of them were joining via mobile telephones. Half of them actually had laptops to facilitate their participation. We had a serious choice to make as a member of civil society. If we were unable to put our workshops online, we would not have been able to continue to reach survivors and provide the support. And I must thank organizations such as the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago that would have partnered with us to provide business support, the British High Commission, etc., that funded our Survivor Entrepreneurship Pitch competition and seed capital and grants. So we definitely had to put all our economic empowerment workshops, business training, and mentorship, everything had to happen online to reach our survivors. Thanks.
I believe that Womantra may want to say something before I speak to the services of the coalition.
So 2 points I actually wanted to share. One was that the TTPS did actually report an increase in reports. Now, because of the increase in reports, we can't necessarily make a determination of whether there was an increase in domestic violence situations or simply because there was a TTPS app and now it became easier to report that there was an increase. But between the 2-year period of March 2020 and March 2022, they received more than 6,000 reports of domestic violence compared to March 2018 to March 2020, where there were only 2,710 reports of domestic violence. So that's one thing I wanted to share. The other thing is that we would have started our Elma Francois Legal Clinic during the pandemic. So we started in 2021, and this took us into 2020. So we don't necessarily have information or data to compare to previous years outside of the pandemic, but some of the changes that we would have had to implement or some of the online options were things like making sure that clients could be able to sign documents. And this was a challenge for a lot of people. Some of our clients were not tech savvy. They had difficulty using the forms, and so we had to adapt. Some applicants were able to verbally consent to being clients of the organization, and so I think that there is room to adapt, but it does take time.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, in relation to the services that the Coalition Against Domestic Violence provided online after the pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, we provide psychosocial support. Counsel, and that for the most part is emergency counseling. So women and their families who are in harm's way access a psychologist through online virtual Zoom calls and telephone calls to help them get a pathway to safety. Also, this is a mechanism through which we can do referrals to other services to secure protection and non-recurrence. The Coalition Against Domestic Violence also has a pro bono legal aid, a team of lawyers providing pro bono advisory services, and we also noted that, we started those services in the context of the pandemic. So like Womantra, we don't have anything to compare before, but certainly there's a big demand for legal aid, having regard to what I understand to be the current restrictions of access to legal aid, state legal aid for domestic violence cases. So women or people who are affected by domestic violence who need advice before they file applications, they may not. We are able to provide those kinds of advisory services to them. And the prevention programming continued amongst all of our organizations, doing community outreach and education, particularly working with young people.
Just before we go back to Member Beckles, Member Mohit, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a question to Ms. Mohammed, who would have indicated earlier that in terms of survivors, the challenges faced as it relates to accessibility in terms of the rental assistance and domestic violence survivors. Ms. Mohammed, if you can just share with us, in terms of your numbers, how many survivors were evicted? And in addition to that, how many of them were able to access the rental assistance grants? And what has become of those who were evicted and couldn't access those rental grants? So we can have an idea as well on this committee. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Member Mohit, for that question. Unfortunately, we don't have all the data to share on this matter at Conflict Women, but what I can do is to answer your final question. Those who were evicted and were unable to access the rental assistance grant, they had to resort to either family and friends and homes, shelters, etc., to find accommodation. It was an extremely difficult process. And we also had other survivors where they don't have, very many support networks. This is often a challenge we know that survivors face. So they would have had to quickly get funding, whether it was a donation, whether it was temporary, etc., to relocate for themselves and their children. And one case in particular is one that just kind of broke my heart. One of the survivors who would have reached out to us for support, she had an autistic child. And because she was evicted during COVID, and we would have helped her to, with funding and so forth, so she could move her items, and she was awaiting the rental assistance grants, and she's not able to work because the child requires so much specific attention and support that she has to be there to support him all the time. So that's just to give you kind of an example of one of the cases.
Thank you. Member Beckles, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to say that your submissions outline several recommendations aimed at improving the state's current support for victims of domestic violence, including effective access to justice, safe housing, social protection and livelihood, and prevention. Can you indicate which of these would you say is most in need of additional resource allocation from the state?
Ms. Clark, is there someone in your group you can assign to that, or would you like to take it? You're still muted. Roberta, you're still muted.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to share that with everyone. It's a difficult question because, I don't think that we have the information about what the state allocates to these services in relation targeted for domestic violence. One of the requests or the demands, I should say, because I think now we want to reach the language of demands, or expectations of the organizations associated with the Alliance, is that we need a national action plan to address all forms of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And that action plan will tell us, which would be time-bound, and would tell us what are the resources allocated to the various sectors. So I don't think right now we have any sense of that. But I think in relation to the public sense, there has been quite a bit of attention paid to police and the establishment of the gender-based violence unit, but also the child protection unit within the police. So we understand that there may be special resources go into that, but certainly there's a lot of attention on the administration of justice and policing. I think there's less attention on the social services part. And not only social services by way of access to counseling and social service intervention, but access to social protection, and in particular, cash transfers for many women who are stuck in situations of dependency. And in the context of COVID, and Asiya can speak more about that, or well, everybody can, how many women lost their jobs because in fact, women tend to be in the precarious economic sectors, in the informal economy. So there was a lot of job loss, and women, for the most part, carry a disproportionate burden of care of children, sick, and the elderly. So we can expect that their poverty levels or their income was affected in a negative way. But there is no eligibility or category for eligibility from what we can understand for access to social assistance, because one is a low-income victim of domestic violence. And so many women are in fact trapped with their perpetrators, and they don't have access to alternative housing either. So we feel like that's something to talk about. And of course, the whole prevention is wide open, because we certainly don't think we've done enough to change social norms and address the causes of gender-based violence. But I believe everyone in the coalition would have maybe a different perspective on this, or another perspective on what are the underserved areas of state response.
Yes, I agree with.
Quickly, can I just quickly ask a follow-up? So you are saying that you all are not aware as to what social services is offered? That is not, you're not aware of that?
No, we're not aware of the money value of it. You asked what are the resources that are available to the services. That's how I understood the question, Honorable Beckles, but I don't know what those numbers are. I don't know what the resource allocations are to the various sectors.
Okay.
Ms. Acosta, and then Dr. Hussein.
So actually, I 100% agree with everything Roberta said in terms of like trying to choose one. But I think in terms of immediate need, I would lean towards housing. I don't know if Sharon had a question or a response, but because I saw that she said she can't access the raise hand option, so I wanted to raise awareness of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hussein, and then Shona.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair. Also to note that Sharon Hartford has her hand up as well.
Yeah, we're going to get to her right after. Thank you.
I think the point needs to be made in responding to questions about where would we put the financial and administrative priorities. I think the point needs to be made that greater transparency from the state, as Roberta Clark said, in terms of understanding the allocations and also in terms of tracking the impact of those allocations, not just saying, you know, how many grants were handed out. So 200,000 grants, for example, were distributed during COVID, but what is the gender data? How many to women? How many to men? Were we able to say what difference it made? So you're speaking in this context to civil society organizations who are extremely small and who are doing primary care work principally, and therefore cannot collect the kind of data but rely on the state to collect the data. And so one of the recommendations, and this doesn't require, Honorable Beckles, this doesn't necessarily require additional funds, to get back to your question. What it does require is, I think, a better coordination in terms of reporting. That way, you know, money spent can actually indicate what was the impact of that and what was the gap. And just to highlight that a study was conducted by Dr. Asha Kambon, looking, for example, at how women and men were financially affected across a range of sectors: agriculture, migrants, working in the retail and service sector, self-employed, and so on. And that report has not yet been approved to make public, but would be extremely valuable, for it traced the economic impact in terms of COVID. And one of the things that it looked at was the receipt of grants and the way that there was a vast disparity where 2/3 of men were where the grants were accessed by 2/3 of the grants were accessed by men and 1/3 of the grants were accessed by women, for example. And coming to understand those inequalities is very important to the ways we can shape our priorities that are cost effective, in addition to the kinds of social services and social protection funding necessary. I want to hand over to Ms.
Shona, and then Shona Alexander, and then we go to Ms. Sharon Hartford, please.
I just would like to speak to the one question that the chair asked earlier, if DV service providers were listed on the emergency providers list during the time of COVID. And from where I sit and from the work that our team have been doing on the ground during that time, the answer is no. Which placed persons experiencing violence at a greater risk in a holistic framework. The other thing, we do have some numbers that we can share with the committee subsequently related to how many persons reached out to us for support during that COVID period to show the increase from years previous. The other thing, one, in terms of allocation for organizations related to state agencies, specifically the social welfare department, the state does not have a transparency mechanism that shows how much money is allocated, one, specifically to individuals and that access the services. So we had individuals who we assisted with completing forms, going to social services, and up to this point in time, many of them have never received a response. We called, we sent emails. There were persons who received emails showing that they were approved, showing, and then you will get another response saying, well, we made an error with your names, so that has to go through another process. And up to this time, we're still waiting. So we know where there's no transparency, there's room for corruption. And a lot of that ensued during the time of COVID with social services.
Thank you, Ms. Sharon Halford. Thank you for your patience. Go ahead, please, and then Member Ford. Ms. Halford?
Thank you very much, Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. I'd like to address a couple of things very quickly. First of all, during the pandemic, a couple of things that we found is, well, we were closed because our property became literally inhabitable and we were doing a tremendous amount of fundraising. We were able to start our renovation, but we had to stop during COVID. We did, however, continue to offer virtual telephonic counseling, reach out to past residents and do the same thing as ASEA, the hampers, trying to see how we could help. What we did find is that some past residents who were able to take advantage of telephonic counseling, they were no longer able to do that because they had actually gone back to their perpetrator. And of course, the perpetrator was at home. So they were unable to continue the counseling. So that was answering your question earlier, our experience during COVID. Going to Honorable Beckles' point asking about services. My comment from the shelter standpoint is very different. Services, we start with 800 SAVE. That's usually our first point of contact with a potential resident. 800 SAVE does not offer the same advice or the same support to individual callers. We have had callers being told in a caller from Tobago, there is no shelter in Tobago, but they do have gender-based violence police officers there. The gender-based violence unit is represented in Tobago, and the victim was told, I think you should call Advocate Onika Mars and see how she can help you. There was no offer to call the police for her. There was no, where are you? Are you safe? Can we get to you? But there's been another time when we have actually had a mother and her children escorted by the gender-based violence unit over on the ferry, brought to us, and I will admit publicly here now, we were closed. And we hired temporary staff because this woman and her children had absolutely nowhere to go. It was street or death. So we hired temporary staff, brought her up to the shelter, and those of us who were involved in running the shelter and dealing with the renovation, we had enough rooms where she was safe with her children and comfortable, and we handled everything after that.
So there's no shelter in Tobago that you or any one of you guests know about?
We have just heard that we have been awarded a property by the House of Assembly, but that I can tell you what you know the Trini saying, you said we could be relatively casual. I'm selling you what I bought. I have not spoken to Onika to confirm that. I don't know if any members of the Alliance, and by the way, the shelter is also a very proud member of the coalition and the Alliance. Continuing with services. We have to, I love the term ASEA came up with, we have to navigate through every ministry basically. But having someone who can do the navigation, all that does is put the frustration on one person's head. Because you have to call social services, you have to deal with the Attorney General's office, you have to deal with the police, you have to deal with the Ministry of Health, you have to deal with labor, you have to deal with education, and you don't know who you're getting on the phone. You don't, is it the same person you spoke to the last time who was not able to get further than their desk to help you? There needs to be attention paid to the fact that women and children are being murdered. and the only way they can get help. This is a complicated issue that starts from a point of love. It starts from a love affair, or it starts from a family love situation. It's complicated, and it requires a holistic response.
Just before I go to member Ford, and any member of the guests before us can answer this. So there is no direct conduit to any division in the Office of the Prime Minister, Ministry of Gender and Child Development, which I would presume would have some sort of coordinating division with NGOs in particular who are on the ground. Is that your experience?
They do not coordinate through the ministries. No. We can call the Office of the Prime Minister to speak to them, read what they are doing. But there is no mechanism, no person, no office that helps domestic violence survivors or the shelters, those of us, the NGOs who are providing the grassroots service to get them to safety and sustainability. There is nowhere to call to say, okay, I've got a mom in here, she's got 3 kids. These are their ages, we need to get these kids in school. She can't work right now because where she is, the perpetrator knows about it. Or she can't work because she has no skills. We need to get job training.
Are there any of you who have been called to participate in, been given a document, a multi-sectoral task force formed to discuss gaps and actions taken to remedy gaps identified in the report on children homes by the OPM or domestic violence or gender-based violence in general? Any of you are part of that task force? Okay, Member Ford, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to clarify a statement made by Ms. Roberta Clark and also made by Shafia Acosta, right? In Ms. Clark's opening remark, she said that most domestic violence goes unreported. But in Ms. Acosta's brief, she mentioned that between 2020 to 2022, approximately 6,000 reports were made. Could we get a clarification as to those 6,000 reports? Those 6,000 reports are reported to whom? And then with regards to Ms. Clark's statement, goes unreported again to which organization, to which department? I'd like to get some clarity there, and I'm sure the listening public would like to at this time also.
So just to clarify, the 6,000 reports were reports that the TTPS had documented. So this is their data. And Roberta, you can share this as well, but I know that even though there was those 6,000 reports, that is still a low number. Like, on the reporting has been, gender-based violence has been underreported for a long time. And even though there would be an increase, there would still be victims suffering in silence and not reported. So, Roberta, if you want to add anything else to that as well.
Sure, I would, but I also want to invite Dr. Hussain because she was involved in the prevalence surveys that gave us some indication on the underreporting, and then I can answer the question of where do people go when they report.
Okay, what we'll do is we take Dr. Hussain, and then we'll go to Member Beckers for the last question to the Alliance, and then we move on to Member Singh for the Center for Nonviolence Research and Development, because we're trying to manage your time equitably. Dr. Hussain, go ahead, please.
Thanks so much, Member Ford, for your question. Just to say that there are multiple sites that collect different and contradictory data. So you can get data from the TTPS, you can get data from 800-SAVE, you can get data, for example, from the Child Protection Unit. There are multiple sites. So what Ms. Acosta, for example, was speaking to, or what you can get from the TTPS is, for example, and just to go back, Chair, to your opening remarks on that there's a debate whether or not gender-based violence has increased. I don't think there's a debate. If you look at the administrative data that was collected. So, for example, Ms. Jack Martin, for example, who was the Director of Gender Affairs, reporting on the Trinidad and Tobago Central Registry and its data, highlighted that 4,500 plus calls were made from January to October 2020. as opposed to 2,096 calls for that corresponding period, which she described as representing an increase of 119%. Again, between January to August 2020, there were more than 1,000 reports received versus from January to August 2019, which represented a 55% increase. So I think the administrative data, and you all will be speaking to the state agencies, will be able to answer this question about their increasing report. To get to the fact of the unreporting, how do we know? The unreporting is, or the underreporting is very easy to know, because in the Women's Health Survey, which was the first national prevalence survey conducted in Trinidad and Tobago, published in 2018, the data showed that 1 in 3 women report violence, physical or sexual violence, in their lifetime. The data also suggested that in the 12-month period prior to the study being published, the data being collected, that number was significantly higher, that you could have 100,000 women, for example, who were living in conditions of violence in this period. So it is not simply 1 in 3 that represents a lifetime. It reflects very high numbers in a current moment. Now, what does that mean? That means that the numbers of prevalence, which we know from that study, are much greater than the numbers of reporting, which we get from the administrative data. What was also shown in that study is that of women who experience violence, only 7% report to the police. 2% or less report to state agencies. So we know that even amongst those who report violence, that those that actually go to state agencies are much lower. And so this committee can turn to that Women's Health Survey in order to track that data. One last point I want to make, Chair, with your indulgence, is not as we're moving from the Alliance, is not so much about the data per se, but gets back to Honorable Beckel's question around priorities and responses, and again, ones that are cost effective as I close. And I want to make a very, very strong plug to this committee for the Health and Family Life Education Program. And that is on the side not of response, but of prevention. It does not require a vast increase in funds, but what it does require, as Ms. Clark said at the beginning, is extreme political will. And currently, the Health and Family Life Education Program, in which the IGDS is involved in integrating the gender-based violence component, is facing a lot of resistance to being implemented in a way that can actually address these challenges around gender beliefs and values and gender-based violence. And so it is very necessary at this point for us to not only tackle interventions, which do require greater funds, as our colleagues here are pointing out, but also to strengthen the prevention strategies that may already be in existence, that may not require a great increase in funds, but which require a lot of political will and a lot of and a strong recommendation from this committee.
Thank you, Member Nakid, and then Member Beckles, because we need to go to the focus on the Center for Nonviolence Research and Development. Member Nakid, a quick question, please, and then Member Beckles will have one more question for the Alliance.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I've heard a lot of political will phrase bandied about, and I've realized that the fundamental issue is not only a lack of resources strategically placed where it should be, and so. So my question, since we're looking for solutions, not only just to have you here and question you on what we already know, what kind of lobbying has been done by you all? Because political will is determined by the kind of pressure placed on politicians. I would like to know what kind of lobbying has been done by your organizations in order to get the kind of resources that you people need to have things done and get things done. I would like to know that.
I think I'm going to direct that one at Ms. Clark.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't, I have a lot to say about that, but I think I would start off saying that all of us are aware of the prevalence of domestic violence in this country. And so therefore we all share the obligation to respond in the context that wherever we have influence. So just to start off by saying that there's no secret about the epidemic that is domestic violence. The non-governmental organizations have done many things, many years. For the first, I can start off with opening the safe houses. The first 2 safe houses were opened in the 1980s, were opened by non-governmental organizations, by women actually, who just had to make a difference. The lobbying for the Domestic Violence Act, not just the lobbying, the intellectual content was provided by non-governmental organizations, and non-government organizations have been tracking the effectiveness of implementation of the Domestic Violence Act over the last 30 years. And in fact, this act has been improved 3 times. And that is really in large part, because of the vigilance and attention of non-governmental organizations. We routinely seek to meet with the police. We routinely seek to meet with members of the judiciary. We routinely seek to meet with the executive branch to articulate what we think needs to be done to improve. And in this submission that we have made available to the select committee, and we will finalize it, you will also see inside of this reference to meetings we've had at shelters, meetings we've had with the police, case management reports that speak to the need for coordination and all of that. So we do our advocacy, first of all, through evidence, and we do evidence-based advocacy, and we do research, and of course we do our campaigns every year. I'm sure you know about those. But what we do want is more people to be involved in that. All of us who know about domestic violence have an obligation to speak up and act, and we think it's a common and shared responsibility. And we're really, really happy that the select committee, we're encouraged that this joint select committee has taken this issue on, and you join us in our advocacy to build political will and community will.
Thank you. I'm glad that you said that, because what came to me, and I'm going to go to Member Beckles now, is that the mindset in some sectors that it is a woman's issue or an NGO's issue is part of the problem. And it is a labor issue, it is a state issue, it is a private sector issue, it is an education issue, it is a national issue, it's a global issue. And if we don't understand that we are all supposed to be lobbying, then we miss the boat. Member Beckles, your final question before we go to Member Singh, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. So again, going back to your submissions that survivors reported not being able to access legal aid services from the Legal Aid and Advisory Authority during the pandemic. So can you indicate how did this affect the lives and livelihood of the survivors of domestic violence? And I guess, like Member Naked, if there are any suggestions that you would like to give to the committee.
And if you could just clarify also, because part of the document that you submitted also in more detail states that, and I quote, survivors reported not being able to access legal aid from the Legal Aid Authority. The office was closed to the public, and calls to emails went unanswered. This caused distress, hopelessness, and loss of trust in services to assist survivors of domestic violence. So is it that legal aid offices were closed during the pandemic? Can you clarify that, please?
I can clarify, because I believe that was my contribution. Yes. So as part of the Elmer Francois Legal Clinic, we had several people reach out to us, and not everyone been survivors of domestic violence. And so we had referrals to different organizations. CADV was one, the Legal Aid Authority was one. And sometimes we literally just didn't have enough attorneys on hand to be able to assist all the potential.
But not having enough is not the same as being closed. Was it open and limited or limited to? Or your legal clinic? So
our legal clinic would refer onward, and so the Legal Aid Authority was one of the state agencies that we referred to, and people would call back and say there's nobody answering. I would call, my colleague would call, we would send emails, and it didn't go anywhere. So one point, I asked my friend to just drop me off in front of the office, because I literally just had to go to see what was going on, and they had a sign on the front door. And there was someone inside She said she could not let me in. The security guard said they could not let me in because of the pandemic and that I should send an email. And it was the same email that we had used previously to try to get in contact with someone. And so it basically was a dead end. And so some people did express.
Legal aid was deemed an essential service. That's very surprising to hear that service wasn't available during the pandemic. Anyway, thank you, Member Beckers. Member Singh, go ahead, please. We're going now to the submissions by the Center for Nonviolent Violence Research and Development. Member Singh, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'll go quickly into some of the concerns I have in relation to the report submitted by the organization. So quickly, I see that the organization identified an increase in reports from persons experiencing intimate partner and family violence, especially during the pandemic period. But I also see that there was a convergence of multiple factors that contributed to these increases. Now, I would like to know, I've heard a lot from a lot of us here today, especially.
Member Singh, you may want to turn off your camera. You seem to have a bandwidth issue, so you're buffering a lot.
That we use or
Member Singh,
been hearing in recent times as a result of some people not reporting certain types of violence. I think you need to repose the question, Member Singh, because we missed quite a bit of it during your technical issue there. Could you repose the question, please? Member Singh, is she still on? Okay, I think he may be having some technical issues there. I think the question he was posing relates to submissions indicate that one of the trends observed by the organization was the number of innovative ways clients used to connect with the organization. Could you give us a sense of those mechanisms, please, while Member Singh reconnects?
For one, because of the presence of the pandemic, the digital use of digital tools was heightened. So persons use multiple digital ways that they would not have used initially to connect with the organization, be it WhatsApp, be it Zoom, other forms of visual software and so forth, text messages. But I remember one woman who was seeking help, and she was unable to have access to any digital tools. And she used the postcard and asked her neighbor to drop it off to one of our community officials, Ms. Leonora Lisaldo, because she was in critical need of not only food supplies, but other type of hygienic supplies for herself and her children. So we saw this emergence of people experiencing violence using creative ways to connect with persons to seek help.
Member Singh, you can go ahead now, please. I think we got you back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right. So, as I was indicating, we've heard from another member indicated that sometimes the reports of domestic violence are underreported, or sometimes they are not reported at all. And I was wondering if this is a result of persons not understanding what can be posed or what the terminologies we use. And in the report, in your submission, I saw intimate partner and family violence. I saw situation violence, violence of opportunity, domestic and family violence. So I was wondering if you can elaborate for us in terms of some of these terminologies that we use, because I will tell you, in some rural communities, violence is taking place, but sometimes the victims don't even know, how to report it, or the terms being used in modern day society might not be aware. They might not be aware of some of these things. So in some of the terms, if you could just elaborate briefly on situational family violence. I also see food apartheid, ACES, and especially intimate partner and family violence. If you could give us some examples, perhaps. Thank you.
First, let me say that each individual understands violence differently. And that understanding of violence can be compounded based on their risk or protective factors. The risk factors, which may be a lack of literacy, formal education. Another risk factor may be a lack of food, which leads to food scarcity. So there's this lack of nutrition to provide effective cognitive functioning, to understand certain elements and certain things that may be occurring within their social space. The need for a national communication plan, an effective adequate and contextualized national communication plan related to domestic violence is critical, because many times we have information being shared about domestic violence that is above the head of certain classes of individuals within our population. When we speak about intimate partner violence, we speak about any type of violence, not just one violence being isolated, but any type of violence, an element of that violence being manifested between individuals, whether they are cohabitating, whether they are working in an environment, whether they are strangers on the street. Intimate violence. Many times we isolate intimate partner violence to relationship violence in the context of sexual relationship, and we leave out the other aspects of violence, of intimate partner violence, or the elements that occurs within the working environment, on the streets, within communities, within schools, within religious organizations. When we speak about situational violence, we speak about, during the time of COVID, individuals who did not manifest any type of aggression or physical violence. We saw rates of that occurring within family units and within relationships because of the external pressures of losing a job, having to navigate this space of understanding when the rent is due, how we're going to pay the rent, we're being evicted. So those external factors enhanced an emotional response where persons were not educated in terms of emotional regulation and how to deal with those situations in a healthy manner. They acted out. That was not a form of generational violence, which is a cycle of violence that continues through the generations of individuals from different households. Violence based on opportunity. We saw where landlords use the opportunity of women who lost their jobs and not having the financial or resource capacity to pay their rents, were coerced into sexual situations, or they were forced out on the street. So when we speak about violence based on opportunity, that's what we're speaking about. We're also speaking about the increase of the domestic trafficking, where mothers who lost their jobs, someone came in and offered to take care of the home. They have their daughter or they have their son, and we saw violence occurring based on that situation of domestic trafficking. So I don't know if I answered your question, but you can let me know.
You certainly have shed some more light in terms of the understanding of some of these instances. I want to jump into one of your recommendations indicated increase public awareness campaigns to break the stigma against male victims of domestic violence. I would like to know, what are some of the specific strategies that can be used to accomplish this goal?
While our organization continues to champion for the prevention of violence in all its form, we understand that the statistics shows that women and girls are in the greater population and as are labeled quote-unquote statistics for experiencing violence. At the same time, we cannot negate that men and boys are also victims of violence, and the state has a responsibility to provide services and programs to support men in their process of addressing their pain, similar to what they will do for women. Now, at the same time, and I have to say this because I am a woman, I'm also a woman who is a thriving survivor of violence. When there is an emergence of a situation, you have to address the emergence of that situation and the consequences related to it. But you also have to address the other factors and the other emergencies that are arising. Added to some of the solutions, I will hand over to Asha Garib, who may answer this question.
Sure. So fighting domestic violence, it has to be a twofold approach, because if you just focus on, dealing with the victims, what about the perpetrators? Are they just left there to continue this cycle? And exactly that, what about the male victims of domestic violence, which is a very real underreported issue? Now, this is where gender sensitivity, it has to come into play from as early as preschool, primary schools, where there has to be some type of gender sensitivity program training that boys and girls are emotional beings. Boys and girls can be strong, boys and girls can be weak. And it has to start from small, this gender sensitivity in terms of, yes, men can be abused, men do cry, men do hurt, and they need to be able to feel safe to express that. And this is where, if we tackle this issue in terms of gender sensitivity from preschools, primary schools, it will have a long-term effect. Because think of it, a child who goes to school and he learns, okay, well, I am a full human being. I am allowed to cry. I am allowed to hurt. I am allowed to report these instances. This child will have greater confidence in speaking to his family members, because they know they're not going to make fun of him. He knows when he becomes an adult, if he goes to the police service and he reports being victimized by a female perpetrator, he has to have confidence. So the fight against domestic violence, it has to be a twofold approach, because, and we see it all the time, how many times are there re-offenses? So somebody abuses their spouse once, twice, 5 times, and it just goes on and on and on. And there has to be some type of program to treat perpetrators of abuse, because we have to tackle, well, why are they doing this? What's driving them to abuse? What's driving them to deal with their problems like this? And until we really get into the minds of perpetrators, that will make a significant difference in terms of the fight against domestic violence.
I have a question before Member Singh continues, and it was sparked by Mrs. Benjamin's diverse and delineation of the different aspects of domestic violence. And the question will go to Mrs. Benjamin first, and then Colin Mitchell, who's been very patiently standing by there. Appreciated Colin and Ms. Harford, and then Roberta Clark. And are we underestimating in Trinidad and Tobago the linkages between the general violence we're seeing, the general crime we're seeing? Because to me, if someone will pick up a gun and shoot somebody to rob them, or assault somebody in the street for whatever reason, that person will have the type of mindset to think nothing of abusing somebody at home. And are we underestimating the general pervasiveness of violence in the society with the kind of exponential reporting or non-reporting of the existence of domestic violence and intimate partner violence we're seeing in the society as a whole. And I'll start with Mrs. Benjamin on that, and then go to Roberta, Colin, and then Roberta, because to me, there is obviously some sort of linkage with it. If people are seeing runaway crime in a society that is not being arrested, or persons not being brought to justice in a timely manner, it kind of leads into people feeling a level of impunity where domestic violence situations are concerned. Mrs. Benjamin, first, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Violence is a broad umbrella term for different elements and types of violence that occur within our society. No one type of violence acts or stands alone. It has other types and elements of violence interconnected to it. Now, no person gets up one morning and says, I'm going to be a perpetrator. I'm going to pick up a gun and go rob and kill and steal. Something happened in that individual's life, whether they were exposed to violence, they witnessed violence, they experienced violence, the risk factors within their social environment was lacking. They, were heightened. The protective factors were lacking. And what happens when persons grow in different environments, they develop mental models. Those mental models and the hidden rules of their class carries over into every relationship and every exchange within society. So we have underestimated we have underestimated the level of violence in every area of society, because many of the forms and the elements of violence have been so interwoven within what is called culture that we see it as a familiar part of our living process. When we begin to unpack violence and the impact of it and the detriment to our human resource, our systems, then I think there may be a serious move and an enhanced move to address violence. Before I end, I would like to address something that I think it was committee member Naked asked about the lack of resources. And too often we link resources to finances. And I would be the first one to say, yes, we need money for everything. All of us represented here in our NGOs, we need finances. But we also leave out resources in terms of intellect, emotions, planning, so that you have a lot of people who are ill-equipped, placed in positions that they cannot function in, and thereby creating tyranny of the moments that create concrete thinking and reactive thinking for key incidents and social problems like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of violence that exist within our society. I hope I answered your questions.
Yes, you did. Mr. Mitchell?
Chairman, just to touch on something you mentioned just now regarding education, and some of my colleagues were speaking about how do you deal with the perpetrators and how do we stop it from the beginning. And I believe it was Asha who spoke about childhood education from as early as preteen. I want to share a quick story that I think would connect with everyone. Recently, we had a Movie Town fundraiser, which was quite weird because coming out of the pandemic, no one was going to the movies, and we had this fundraiser, and before you know it, the support was overwhelming. At that time, you realize every front page, almost every day, 4 days in a row, we had murders regarding domestic violence. It was actually 4 days in a row. And the tickets really started to sell to the point where Mr. Chin had to give me a second theater because it was selling so much. The support was so overwhelming at that time. And of course, it comes in waves like that, right? Media coverage and everyone supporting. And I decided, you know what, let me create a short movie and an introduction before we show this movie premiere to talk a bit about gender-based violence and the shelter and a survivor, what she's been through, what we did for her, and where I see the shelter going. I just shared the link on our chats when everybody has a chance after. You can watch it. It's not very long. It's like a 10-minute movie. And I asked our founder, previous independent Senator Diana Mahabir, if I could come and film her for a bit and ask her a few questions. And we went to her home. And I asked around who were the best videographers that I could get. And I found out about these two young guys, and I contacted them separately. And these young boys showed up, and they all organized with their cameras, and they set up. And I started to ask Mrs. Mahabir some questions. And that little quick session turned into almost 3 hours of very, very intense, emotional conversation. And when it ended, I won't talk a lot about what she said, but when it ended, she said, basically, she started this fight over 40 years ago. And she believes that the violence in Trinidad now is worse than it was then. And gender-based violence is much worse now than it is then. And she felt to herself as if she were a failure because she devoted her whole life towards fighting this cause. And she really felt like a failure. And one of the young guys took off his headset and he hung it on the camera and he walked across to her and he hugged her. And she was like, "Why are you hugging me?" And he said, "Only when you started to speak, I realized who you were. I am a victim of domestic violence, and I left my home very young. And I came to serve all, and you and Father Panton were the founders and the people who run Serval. And there, during my classes, I was educated about gender-based violence and what's right and what's wrong, and how to break the cycle that I was involved in generationally from my family, seeing it from generation to generation. And I'm about to propose to my girlfriend, and I'm here working today to save money to buy the ring for her and so on. And you changed my life. And Serval taught me about graphics and so on, and it led me to start videography, where you all taught me about how to do video work and so on. And I have a career today because of you. And you are sitting here trying to tell me now that you are a failure, but you changed my life and the many other people's lives who you have changed. So education about gender-based violence to him as a young boy coming out of a home with gender-based violence has taught him how to break the cycle. And unfortunately, in our education system, we don't expose each other into a class on gender-based violence. It's coming to what you were saying earlier, Chair, when let's talk about education. It does have to start very early. So I agree with Asha on that.
Before I go to Roberta on the question of the general violence situation, it just occurred to me that you are the only guy here, and I know that there are other men working behind the scenes in advocacy against domestic violence. Why aren't more men involved?
I try to get more men involved. Even the shelter is run by 9 executive members, all volunteers, of which I am one, and I'm the chairman, and I only have one other male with me, and I did ask many other males to join me, and the struggle is real to get men involved. It's a very taboo subject.
Isn't that sad though, because the issue is related to primarily men?
Correct, and that's why I didn't share that as the correct, and that's why I shared that short story with you just now to say education and educating men that we have to get involved, because we are main part of the problem. Most of the domestic violence cases are perpetrated against females. So yes, there are a few males, but really the dominant part is females, and we have to get involved and we have to speak to each other, and we need to educate each other on what is right and what's wrong. And they spoke earlier about the generational problem where you've seen your father do it and you've seen your grandfather do it, and it is okay. And certain places have been to believe that, well, once you don't mark the woman, you're okay. So yes, she needs some licks on a Friday, but make sure you don't hit her in areas that you could see. So stay away from her face and her arms, and then everywhere else is fair game. This is a belief that a lot of them actually have. And the only way to overcome this and to tell them that it's wrong is not just saying it's a crime. Yes, we need to educate them that it's actually a crime, but really, this is not okay and it's not acceptable. Times have changed, society has changed, and what may have happened in the past is no longer okay in the present.
I see it all the time in terms of the advocacy and the lobby groups, and I know there are men working behind the scenes in some of the group, but 90% are female, and the message is targeted at men primarily. Roberta, and then we will go to Member Singh's final question, and then Member Ford with the shelter. Go ahead, Roberta, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a really big question you've asked, and I think both Sherna and Colin have answered parts of it. Violence is connected to inequalities in our country, and it could be gender inequalities or socioeconomic inequalities. We know it's about, people sort of feeling not committed to their country in the way in which we think about it as peaceful and empathetic and kind. And yes, children who observe, the data is quite clear, children who observe violence in the home have a higher likelihood. It's not a certain thing, because of course we all have agency and we can make decisions in our life, but there's a greater likelihood that those children will grow up to be adults who perpetrate or to be victims of domestic violence. So you just have to think about what is the environment in the home where children are witnessing their mothers being beaten and abused, and they themselves, because there's also a lot of child abuse in this country, are experiencing that. The anger, the rage, the way in which that distorts the psychological development. There was a study done of a number of countries in the Eastern Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago on attitudes to corporal punishment against children as a form of discipline. And very sadly, Trinidad and Tobago had the highest level of acceptance, cultural acceptance, for the use of corporal punishment against children. And we seem to not understand the link between beating children and the outcomes. The outcomes for society. So I think that we have to think a lot about that. We have to think about also to the social inequalities that are driving crime and violence in this country. It's not a complete answer, but there is an aspect there. And what do we do when we have young people doing harm and in harm's way? Can we have a more rehabilitative approach to them and a less punitive approach? Yes, we have to hold people accountable, but can we do that in a way that their lives can be transformed? I mean, we've been hearing, for example, of the number of young men on remand yard awaiting trial, 10 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, just awaiting trial in what is amounts to a university of crime and violence. So we do have to think in holistic ways and to come back to our first demand that we need a national strategy. And that strategy will help us connect the dots between domestic violence and societal violence. Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Member Singh, your final question to this sentence, and we go to Member Ford and Member Naked to the shelter.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm okay, so we can go straight to the shelter.
Go to Member Ford, and we welcome Member Ford's questions to the Trinidad Shelter for Battered Women and Children. And Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Hartford.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, as we just mentioned, with regards to the sentiments to Mr. Colin Mitchell as one of the male, championing this cause, hats off to you, sir. In your opening remarks, Mr. Mitchell, you spoke about the operating costs as being 10 times the 750. Now, that's not a typo. That's correctly.
7,500 TT a month we get the subvention.
Which works out to be 75,000 for the year.
Well, 7,500 by 12.
By 12, oh, okay, right.
Which would be $90,000 a year.
90,000, yeah, okay, 90,000. How was this budget derived?
It was just, we give them a full bank statement with all our operational expenses and our fundraising and so on, and we submit it regularly. Every year as requested, and every year we request an increase, and every year we get no response. I met with the Honorable Diana Webster Roy about this before. I mentioned it to two other ministers directly. So we have submissions in writing, and we have not gotten a response or even a response or a positive response. We haven't even gotten a negative response. We had no response.
Okay. And in terms of the budgetary allocation, your biggest allocation expenditure would be around what aspect?
I would say salaries, counseling are our major costs in the shelter. For example, we have a fully qualified matron that oversees the operations of the shelter to ensure we deliver quality and excellence. And her salary is more than the one subvention we get for the whole month.
And this is separate and apart from the voluntary service that you spoke about earlier?
Yes, correct. So for us to be able to achieve what we want to achieve, we had to spend time approaching, for example, the UN Women's Spotlight Initiative, and they are currently funding our program for counseling and some oversight and training for our staff and so on in the shelter currently, because from the government we get absolutely no support regarding the training of our staff at the shelter.
And in terms of your in terms of NGOs and other financial institutions, you all have anybody on board that offer financial obligations, whether monthly or quarterly or yearly, as the case may be?
We offer deed of covenants, and we have a few people who have signed up for it, but regarding regular donations, no, I found that donations in Trinidad have normally been one-off, and they normally want to put it towards a project, which, for example, we did a renovation over the last 2 years that my vice chair would have spoken about. The Foreign Republic Bank would have made a sizable donation towards that one project. But regarding the ongoing, we don't have anyone that really is ongoing. We've partnered with some other NGOs like Field, for example. We've signed up and we get twice a month. They share food stuff and cleaning supplies and so on with us. And we have a few other organizations like Heroes Foundation that have full-time IT staff, and they would come in and help us set up 5 computers that we get donated from from Republic Bank and another organization. But other than that, corporate and private donations, I spend most of my day, I would say 2 to 3 hours a day, soliciting different people that we know and just trying to get money to get us going. For example, I told you just now about the movie fundraiser that we did. We planned for that for 2 months. The president attended. It was the biggest thing, nice, big success. But we only raised enough to run 1 month.
Okay.
All of that effort from all of our 9 executives, everybody buying tickets, president coming, everybody there. We had the Minister of Tourism, everybody there, but you only raised enough money to run 1 month.
I got you. Now, you use the term safe house, right, for these domestic violence, and it's predominantly women.
And children. By us, it's women and their children by us, yes.
And again, now safe house gives the connotation that it's not public knowledge, but this particular spot is known by the public.
No, it's not. We are a safe house. So under the Ministry of National Security, we are a secret location. So for example, when we have new residents coming to us, the police transport them to us from the station. And it creates even more of a challenge for me fundraising because there's nothing tangible that people could see. So sometimes, for example, you'll say, well, Digicel, we want to set up a learning room or we want to do different things. And they'll be like, okay, well, we bring up our team and we'll go and meet. And I have to say, well, no, it actually doesn't work like that with a safe house. We have to keep the location as secret as possible because there are perpetrators out there that want desperately to do violent acts against our women and children. And that's why we have to hide them.
Yes. And that's the reason why I asked the question in terms of to identify that particular of, repercussions coming from individuals and so on. One question again, and then I'll pass you back over to the chairman. In terms of being admitted to the safe house, what's the criteria? What's the procedure? Let's give us a little gist of how the procedure to be admitted into this particular home.
My vice chair, Mrs. Sharon Hofford, actually oversees that area of it. So because it's her area of expertise, that's a simple answer, but because it's her area of expertise, I'll invite her now to get
No problem. Ms. Hofford?
Mr. Ford, you're stuck with another woman now. But we're letting you speak just for a little while.
We get the knowledge, we get the information.
We have... Our first contact is usually 800 SAVE or the Gender-Based Violence Unit. And the proposed victim is interviewed by them, and it is determined then whether or not we can take them. I'll give an example. We recently got a call of a mother who is 34 weeks pregnant. She has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, if I remember. She's pregnant with twins. And all the other shelters have refused to take her because they see her as a risk because they don't have nursing staff. Well, I have had a few children, and because you're pregnant, it doesn't mean that you're constantly a health risk. She is considering coming to the shelter, but she is reluctant at this point because at this stage we are still following Ministry of Health regulations and our residents coming in have to go into quarantine. But our first point of contact is 800 SAVE and the Gender-Based Violence Unit. There are occasions where we will get a call, maybe from a religious institution, because the victim has not had the comfort level in going to the authorities, and they have gone to who they see as being safe. And we will then ask one of our executive committee members who has her doctorate, and she lectures in social work, and she advises our matron, who is also a qualified social worker, for that, and they will interview or they will advise the person how to interview the lady, because we need to determine certain things. If someone has a mental issue, we are not able to take in someone who has a very serious mental issue. If someone has a physical issue where they are not mobile, we do have a chairlift, but we do not have on staff someone who is qualified and capable of bathing someone who is a quadriplegic. So what I did do is we did get a call once about a quadriplegic, and I told her family to take her to the Port of Spain General Hospital emergency and for her to fake a headache. I reckoned it would have taken them maybe about 2 days to determine there was nothing wrong with her head. if they had not been able to contact the family, the safe house they were looking for her for, family out in the country, then go to a stomachache. So she faked for, I think, around 7 days, and I'm sorry, I'm admitting all my bad behavior here, but it gave them time to go and find the family in the country who were willing to take her, because she was a quadriphilic in a wheelchair, and she was being physically and sexually abused and financially abused because her disability grant was being taken from her.
Miss Harford, put a pause in. Let me save you legally from any further possible action. just before we go,
you want to limit our conversation
because this is being broadcast live, and you're advising a member of the public to fabricate illnesses to give away understand your intention. Just before we move on, I just got some information regarding a comment that was made earlier on in terms of a correction. And this is from Mr. Richard Raghubar Singh, Secretary, Legal Aid and Advisory Authority, regarding the comment about legal aid accessibility during the pandemic. And I quote, "We adjusted our systems during the pandemic. We had and continue to have a team that monitors emails and responds accordingly. In addition to, as an essential service, we did not close. Staff would have been rostered, but our data shows that our services continued digitally, in person and via telephone access. I would like the affected person to reach out so we can ascertain if there were any gaps in our systems during 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021. Over 9,000 people in each period accessed us through the means previously stated." So in terms of transparency, that is from the Legal Aid Authority responding to questions. I think from Ms. Acosta that they could not access the services at Legal Aid. Member Naked, go ahead, please. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, since most of my colleagues spoke with you all with more targeted questions, this question is more overarching, and it relates to what I've heard from Mrs. Benjamin and some of the other stakeholders, that we have a lack of public awareness because the culture is so intertwined in how we view domestic violence. Because we know, people before, there used to be violence between spouses, and it would be termed Tobago love, for example. I'm just giving you an example of what we have in the culture. Our carnival and the dancing and all of that, I'll be quite frank, has descended into something almost violent. We have advertisements, think and dirty, jam naked. I'm just giving you an example of what we have in the culture that we see as our culture. I don't, but that's how it is. I'm asking, what kind of public awareness programs has been implemented by all of these associations, all of these NGOs, to really counteract, this is what I call counterculture, that people see as culture, counterculture. I'll give you an example. In Belgium, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a prevalence of domestic violence. There was no social media, but there was a lot of television programs in connection with the local creatives in Belgium, for example. We have so many unused creatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Has there been any synergy between the organization and local creatives to create a serious social media platforms and television platforms? And I know you have budget constraints, but what has been done in synergy with local creatives to create a wider public awareness program about violence at all levels?
That's an excellent question. We can start with Ms. Clark on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think we can say that there's been quite a lot, but definitely not enough. So typically speaking, non-governmental organizations would do campaigns maybe during the 16 days of activism between November 25th and December 10th. And all through the year, we do different kinds of campaigns and different types of outreach to faith-based organizations, with popular artists. I myself have been involved working with Calypsonian and soca artists to produce materials for television and for radio. There's all of that being done. But I think what you're asking, Member of Parliament Naked, is what are we doing that will shift, as you say, counterculture? In fact, probably the culture is more tolerant of violence, and what we're trying to do is countercultural because we're trying to shift away from that. What are we doing to change the social norms of everyone in society? And we've been saying more and more insistently that the response to domestic violence, apart from the services component, we have to now work on prevention and embed prevention within the school system, starting with early childhood education and all the way through, and have very clear messages. And not just messages, the teaching, the pedagogy, the teaching approaches, the curriculum has to also reinforce those messages that we want to send. We need some consistency in that cultural change. And it's more than campaign, it's more than public service announcements. But Asiya has something to say, I think, on this, so I would like to pass over to her. And Member Parliament Naked, we can also send you links to a lot of what we've been doing across many organizations.
Thank you.
Well, that would be appreciated, Mrs. Clark, because to be honest, I've seen some advertisements, some public announcements, but as you said, it's not nearly enough if we have to change the culture and how we view it. I'm sorry, Ms. Mohammed, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Naked. I really like that question, and I think it's an excellent question to pose to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, because we all share a responsibility to eliminate and end gender-based violence. And in fact, the Alliance is the Alliance for State Action to end GBV. And I want to make that point on communications, because I think it's a really important point that you've raised today. The draft strategic action plan to end gender-based and sexual violence, that would provide a holistic response to preventing gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, that key document has been before our cabinet since 2016, and it has not yet been approved. Now, that has really key sectors, of which communications is one, justice is another one, policing, reform, economics, etc. It's all there. It's in a draft strategic action plan. And unfortunately, it's not yet been approved by our cabinet. Now, 6 years have passed. And in 6 years, I think we can all agree that the rates of gender-based violence have increased drastically. Those of us who are in civil society, we've been saying over and over again for years the same thing. Please approve the draft strategy. Please prioritize this issue, right? The cost for us as a people, as a government, as individuals, of not having strategies such as this one approved is that people pay with their lives. We've seen a rise in femicides in this country. As my colleague Colin has just said, in 4 days' time, we had 4 women murdered and 1 young boy. Let's not forget, he was 12 years old. His life has completely... He was murdered. And had we had these strategies, we can move forward in terms of actually implementing and creating the change, both at the cultural and societal level. And I want to acknowledge here that government has started to implement parts of that strategy, but we cannot, all of us together in 2022, be meeting to talk about gender-based violence without having a strategy, a holistic, comprehensive strategy to address GBV in the year 2022. So coming out from today, I really am hoping, and I would like to plead with all the members of the JSC, the chairman, senators, members of parliament, etc., that you call upon government to approve urgently the strategy to end gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago, of which communications is a key component.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned communications because we're running out of time, but I want to pose a question to the group before us, before we ask for your closing comments. We're talking, remember, the issue of communication and messaging in an age of social media where you could get 7,000 people in a fete for $600, where you can move large amounts of people and influence them without putting an ad on radio or TV, just by social media messaging. But there is, and the discussion has centered around counterculture. But we are in an age where, quite frankly, many of the people who we need to target, the people who are in their teens, even younger, in their 20s, have accepted a particular narrative of themselves that is driven by international pop stars. So there's a clash of cultures and a generational clash. And they're not necessarily listening to us on a JSC because we are not their cohort. And I ask myself, if we've had 4 murders of females and a child in 4 days, we have 48 hours social media outrage, and then we go back to whatever we have been doing before and move on. So what is it about our culture, and what can we do to start sending a different kind of message that will elicit the behavior change? Because if the behaviors don't change, the message hasn't resonated, or the message isn't as consistent as it should be or sustained, or the message is not in the format it should be to reach a target audience or the different levels of target audience. Because the message certainly is not getting through. And I'll start with Ms. Acosta on this because she seems to be the youngest amongst us, and no shade to anyone else. And that is where the message needs to go, because we are the ones who are preaching for decades, and we need to reach that generation to elicit the kind of behavioral changes we want in 5, 10, 15 years. We don't want to be talking about this in the same format in 10 years. So, Ms. Acosta, how do we get past Beyonce and Nicki Minaj and get a different kind? And I'm not dissing Beyonce and Nicki Minaj before they come from here. They have wonderful music, but you know what I'm talking about. There are different messages being sent through social media and mass media, which are having different levels of impact on different levels of society.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman, because as you were talking, I in my mind, I was saying we need to actually involve youth. Because this is a forum and it's a government kind of thing, it might not attract young people.
Well, correction, it's a parliament kind of thing involving government, opposition, and independence, right? But I understand your point.
Yeah, I'm oversimplifying, but what I'm trying to express is that if young people aren't involved, then they don't feel a sense of ownership or belonging, and we can message all we want, but if we're talking to them or talking down to them, then it's not going to be received. It has to be a two-way street. It has to be us receiving some communication, maybe opening a TikTok, meeting them where they are. And I'm saying they because I'm almost 30, so I feel like I'm not in that group anymore. I don't speak the language.
You have a long way to go. You're in the group.
I'm doing my best in my grouping. But yeah, involving youth is to me the key to getting them to be receptive to these messages.
Colin or Ms. Harford?
I think today is a fantastic start. I saw a great contribution that the Prime Minister Barbados made recently. I don't know if you all saw it. She made a speech about 2 or 3 days ago, and she was talking about the climate change issue. But I was thinking to myself about how gender-based violence is similar the way they were distributing information on it previously, where we would speak to and information will be sent to, and no one is really speaking with. It's not a two-way street, and it wasn't really a conversation on it. Being a taboo subject, a lot of people will see a message like domestic violence is a crime, that's everyone's business, see it, report it, stop it. That's one of the government campaigns recently, and they feel like they're being spoken to, and they really don't have the forum to have a conversation with. And we need to somehow engage on that level, because being a taboo subject, people have a lot more questions and they have a lot of things they need to speak about. And just having Bungie Garlin go out in a concert and say, treat your woman like a queen. You mustn't beat a woman. I really don't think that will connect. And I think, Chair, you touched on that a bit just now too. We have to find a way of how we're going to connect. How the shelter has been doing it is, Mr. Nakul was asking about why don't we do mass communications and mass media? Well, none of us here have the budget to do that. We're trying to find the money just to feed a house and clothe the victims, or what we like to call them, survivors in our shelter. That's what we consume with every day. So when I do get the opportunity, you find out we did a golf tournament in January. We would use our connections to get the Prime Minister to attend. And then we'll make every newspaper for 1 day or 2 days. And in that message, we try to control the narrative to an extent where, yes, the Prime Minister supported the shelters golf tournament. But
with the greatest of respect, and the Prime Minister is important to get involved, and Her Excellency the President. But is a 22-year-old, and they should be influenced by the Prime Minister's statement, but is a 22-year-old really connected to the Prime Minister's statement, in the wider scheme of things, to the amount of noise coming at them?
No, it doesn't. But what it does is it keeps us in the media. And from the time it keeps us in the media and the limelight, we get to send messages. Each time we get that opportunity and we are asked for a quote or we make a contribution, we try to control our own media releases. We don't let it just go how it wants. We always say our media releases very carefully. And in there, we try to talk about gender-based violence being a crime, how you could get help, who you should talk to, and what you should do. So every time we get that opportunity, that's what we do. So we try to invite guests who would get us into the media. And that's like a smart way of getting into communications and media without paying for it.
Shona, your hand has been up for a while. Go ahead, please.
I'm speaking open here as people. The fact remains that corporate Trinidad and Tobago, the media within Trinidad and Tobago, many philanthropists within Trinidad and Tobago, and many government officials within Trinidad and Tobago want to stay as far away from the issue of violence, be it domestic violence, intimate partner violence, child abuse, as possible. The stories of victims.
Why do you say that?
Because it goes back again to the lack of education. It also goes to the hidden rules of the class to which people belong. People operate with the hidden rules of their class, even in the halls of Parliament, even on social issues that are undermining and pulling out the bottom from our societies and our individuals. I have had companies say to me that area doesn't fall and align well with our marketing approach. There's nothing to receive from aligning with such a cause. So you have companies, corporate companies, many, not all, operating from a transactional approach. I give something to get something. With the issue of domestic violence and working for the sustenance and sustainability of people experiencing violence, what you get is certain amount of intangible profits that increases your social and human capital for your country to be developed and sustainable. A country is identified in the way it treats its citizens. And the way how Trinidad and Tobago has been treating its population, especially those vulnerable populations, has not been good. So we have an issue where persons want to remain as far away as possible from the issue, while hoping that the issue is solved without their intervention, without their ability to open the door, without their ability to ask for transparency. And I believe the time has come for us to remove that conversation of talking over people's head and talking with people. You know, I grew up in Laventille. A part of my life, I grew in Laventille. I grew up in other areas. Many people may not know that. I go to Point Fortin. I sit in Valencia, and I go into homes where people do not have some of the basic amenities. And you know what I do? I sit on the ground with them. I drink from a cup that they wash just with barrel water, because you now looking to develop a relationship that they can identify and build trust with people. Many of the elected officials and persons in positions, these people see them just once every 5 years. That's not service. That's an act of violence. So when we talk about violence, we also talk about it on a broad spectrum. So how do we connect with our younger population? Is being real with them. Being real with them and connecting with them on the levels that we have to research and understand how to do that, to break those kind of hidden rules that carry over into our relationships based on our mental models. Because a lot of us, even our NGOs, are operating in a tyranny of the moment. Lack of resources create a tyranny of the moment. We need to just get this problem solved here and now. How do we work together to provide solutions so we no longer operate in that tyranny of the moment? I see my colleague Shamaya hand as well.
I'm going to have to put a pause because we are certainly out of time. I'm going to go down the list and apologize to you and ask for closing comments. And I'm going to start with Ms. Harford. You're still muted, Ms. Harford. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that my family would be so happy if that was a permanent state. First thing, again, to thank everyone for today, but I would like to go back to something that Roberta said earlier and talking about the relationship that young people see to any level of violence. I don't think they see there is a consequence to violence, and I think violence is also, to a certain level, considered popular and making you important in some areas. Where there's a lack of parenting, gang leaders become parents. They offer a family environment to children who don't have parents at home. And if I remember, I think it was last year at a Rotary virtual meeting, and the TTPS head of the gender-based violence unit said that there was, I'm using the term very loosely, a gentleman in San Fernando who had broken his protection order 7 times. He has yet to appear before a member of the judiciary. He is yet to have a fine or any form of consequence put on him. And I would like to quote my father, who was, in my mind, the wisest person I ever met. Human behavior is based on one of 2 things: seeking a reward or avoiding consequence. The reward could be your own feeling in your heart when you do something well, or it could be the house. Consequence is what you're avoiding. And if there is no consequence and there's no reward attached to living an honest life and following what we are saying here is normal behavior that we would like every Trinidadian to promote, then what's the encouragement for them? You know, what is the encouragement for the 18-year-old, for the 15-year-old who has a gun? We've had a child stand up at a meeting many years ago at Napa, and his counselor stood up at the meeting and said that one of the teachers at the school was having a really hard time getting this boy to study. And he said, but how much money you earn a month? He said, I make more money than you make in a week selling guns and ganja.
Well, that's our value system issue, but that's a different conversation. Thank you.
But the violence, there must be a consequence and a reward to life.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell?
I think we're in closing comments now, Chair.
Yes, thank you.
This was an excellent conversation today. I was very happy to speak with all of you and to meet members of the Parliament from both sides. And of course, see you again, Independent Senator. Thank you for the good work that you do. I know it must be tireless work sometimes. And it was nice to actually get to see my colleagues and chat today. The shelter is doing the best that we can. Our goal is to become the gold standard of shelters in this country. We have some of corporate Trinidad on board with us, supporting us, because one of my colleagues a little while ago spoke a bit about the challenges with companies not coming on board. But what's happening is the problem is so widespread now that it's actually infiltrated into the companies, into the day during their daily work. One of the companies that came to support us most recently came because they're aware of it now, because the perpetrator came to their business place and they had to lock the doors to keep him out because he wanted to kill one of their employees. And everybody was exposed to, so the violence was widespread throughout the whole company, and they had to call police. And They lost a whole day of productivity, and of course the trauma involved with it by the people associated with it. So the shelter is here to support where we can, and we will continue to advocate for the things that need to be done. And thank you to everyone for having us today.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander Benjamin, on behalf of the Center for Nonviolence Research and Development.
I'll hand over my closing remarks to Shamea Owadi, attorney at law.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Good day. Thank you for the opportunity. Chair, I would want to use this opportunity to just address a few in a very, very short way of some of the things that came up during this conversation. Firstly, Chair's question with regard to the youth. One thing that I think that we underestimate is, as my friend was saying, the position of trust. In terms of being an attorney, one thing that we have seen is that persons come to us and essentially bare their hearts, bare their situations, where they would refuse to go to the police. I have personally handled divorces and protection orders where they don't want to report. So in terms of the reporting, that's another issue that came up. We will never get accurate reporting. So in terms of that, what I would also suggest is that in terms of collecting this data, we go to more sources in terms of, for example, attorneys and lawyers. We're bound by confidentiality, but we can provide numbers, ministers of religion, those kind of things. And also in terms of the youth, in terms of that position of trust, something that we can also look at is peer counseling. That has been something that has been especially efficient in terms of the studies that I've read with regard to addressing the situation. Persons are more likely to open up and to understand and to seek attention and help from persons who are on their level. So even something as simple as thriving people who have survived this abuse can be counselors, peer counselors, layman counselors, so persons who are also experiencing, help them through the process and all these things. So thank you, Chair. I will hand over to the Chair again.
Thank you so much. Ms. Acosta, on behalf of Womantra.
Thank you so much. So in my closing remarks, I just want to reiterate the importance of the National Strategic Plan. I want to raise the attention to the discrimination that still exists within the DV Act against members of the LGBTQ community, as well as just sharing as well in terms of service provision that there does need to be some kind of standardized procedure so that we can do proper risk assessment, proper intake, and all these different things that have so far been lacking. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mohammed, on behalf of Conflict Women Limited.
Thank you, Chair. It was definitely an honor to be here today, and I tried my best to do justice to our survivors who are not present in today's hearing. So I'll close by sharing a story from someone, a young man who went to court to fight for his daughter. He'd been fighting for custody for years and years and years. The courts denied him custody and instead granted that custody to his grandmother. Until finally he gave up. He said to me, "I can't do this anymore. I can't deal with the court system. I don't have money to continue. They've given my daughter to the grandmother. I'll just have to accept it." And one day he got a call from the guidance counselor of her school. And that call said to him, "We need you to come right now for your daughter because she was raped by the boyfriend of the grandmother to whom the courts had granted custody as opposed to the father." We have a responsibility as a country to that young girl whose father fought for her for years and years and years within the court system to get custody, and whose rape we could have prevented. Our judicial system could have prevented. Our magistrates could have prevented. So each of us here today, we have a responsibility. All I want for us is to give justice and give voice to our survivors who are suffering when we do not have the right policies and the right strategies in place. So I'll close today by thanking everyone and by urging those present in the JSC, all the members, to lobby as we have been lobbying as the Alliance for the National Strategic Action Plan to end gender-based violence. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think Dr. Hussein had to leave us. So, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of the members of the Joint Select Committee for this kind of thoughtful interaction. I want to say, if we were building a multi-story, complex, large building on shifting ground, there's some parts of Trinidad and Tobago where the ground is not settled. You amass around you architects and engineers, all kinds of engineers, because you put your best minds to constructing a safe building. And what we have here is a very complex problem with specific kinds of causes and multiple consequences. And we need our best minds to be thinking analytically and prescriptively about what needs to be done. And in that regard, we need the evidence. So social scientists have to be at the heart of this response, and especially social psychologists. We keep talking about changing social norms, but changing behavior is a complex thing. Changing the hearts and minds is a complicated thing, and we need professionals to help us who understand neural pathways, who understand social behavior. We need them to help us figure out what is the best way to shift norms. But already we know it has to start in the school system. We have to deal with parenting programs. Dr. Hussain spoke about HFLE. And with all of that, we also have the enforcement to which Sharon referred. We need to have regulation, which we have. We have a lovely, wonderful Domestic Violence Act. Trinidad and Tobago has a shining, wonderful act. But it has to be implemented, it has to be monitored in its implementation, and it has to be enforced. And so I think we need the accountability. We come back to the title of this Alliance for State Action, and we are all about holding the state accountable. And it has to be held accountable through close collaboration with this sector of NGOs who have the expertise and also will collaborate to build out that multi-stakeholder engagement and platform and be on the ground giving the feedback on how things are working. We need the strategy and we need the democratic involvement. And we need, according to Mr. Maxenhouse, we need the money. I think Colin has said that over and over. The NGO sector needs the money to provide the services which the state is not able to provide. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and everyone else.
Thank you.
And just to say, our submission has many, many recommendations across all sectors.
Well, I think you lost everyone under 35 with the Maxenhouse quote, but that's all right. I got it. Thank you, Roberta. And you closed on a point I was going to make, where it seems, and I stress seems, that there is not the kind of consistent collaboration with NGOs and non-for-profit organizations that are on the ground doing the work, interfacing with the cohort that you're trying to intervene on behalf of. And very often, policy designed and implemented in the absence of that type of consistent collaboration, not one of collaboration, consistent, because the ground is shifting all the time. And the best people who know what is happening on the ground as it shifts, improvements included in the shifts, are the people on the ground, the NGOs, and that kind of collaboration is not as consistent, or in some cases as absent as it should be. So, as absent, I should say. So I want to thank you on behalf of the committee for being with us. We appreciate your time and your contributions. Please know that you can submit additional thoughts, comments, and questions and recommendations to the Secretariat. We'll be happy to include them in our final report. And we thank you for your continued good works in this regard in terms of dealing with this issue in Trinidad and Tobago. On behalf of the committee members, I am Paul Richards. Thank you for being with us, and the session is now adjourned. Have a great day and be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. Okay, bye.